My neighbor called the cops because she thought I was up to no good. But when they arrived, I found something that made her disappear. It had been a long day. One of those days where the hours stretched endlessly, and the only thing keeping me going was the thought of finally getting home. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was dipping low, casting an orange glow over the quiet street. I exhaled, feeling that familiar sense of relief. Home. My space. My peace. But before I could even turn off the engine, I noticed something. The gravel near the gate had shifted. Nothing major, but enough to make the latch sit awkwardly. I had been meaning to fix it for a while, but today, something told me I needed to handle it now. So I grabbed a shovel from the garage, kicked off my work shoes, and got to it. The rhythmic scrape of metal against the dirt was oddly satisfying. Just a few scoops, smooth it out, and I'd be done. That was the plan. But plans don't always go the way we think they will. Across the street, someone else was watching. Someone who had already decided I didn't belong. Lisa Montgomery, my neighbor. I didn't see her at first, but she was there, peeking through the curtains, phone in hand, convinced she was witnessing something that needed police intervention. I was just fixing my own damn driveway. But to her, I was digging suspiciously. But while she was calling 911, I was about to uncover something that would flip this entire situation on its head. Lisa Montgomery sat perched by her window, fingers gripping her phone as she whispered into the receiver. "Yes, I'd like to report something suspicious. There's a man. He's digging in a driveway. I don't know if he lives there." The dispatcher asked a few routine questions, but Lisa wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked on me, her paranoia growing with every movement of my shovel. I, on the other hand, was completely unaware. The only thing on my mind was getting this done before dark. I pressed my foot against the metal blade, driving it deeper into the ground. The dirt was tougher than I expected, packed down over years of wear. That's when I felt it. A hard scrape against something solid. I leaned down, brushing away loose soil with my hands. It wasn't a rock. It had edges. Sharp ones. Metal. Before I could dig further, the sharp wail of sirens ripped through the air. Red and blue lights bounced off the houses, casting long shadows as a police cruiser rolled up to my driveway. I straightened up, hands instinctively going still at my sides. 2 officers stepped out, 1 man, 1 woman. They moved with a deliberate calm, but I knew better than to assume they weren't already making judgments. The male officer, Ramirez, spoke first. "Sir, can you step away from the shovel?" I exhaled slowly. Here we go. I lifted my hands, palms open. "I live here. I'm fixing my driveway. That's it." The female officer, Thompson, studied me carefully, while Ramirez flicked a glance toward Lisa's house. She was still watching, her curtains slightly drawn back, pretending she wasn't the one who called. "We got a report about suspicious activity," Ramirez continued, keeping his voice measured. "From who?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Officer Thompson's gaze flickered toward Lisa's window for half a second. She knew too. But this wasn't about what was fair. It never was. I gestured toward the spot where I had been digging. "Look, I was just trying to fix the latch on my gate. That's it. But while I was digging, I found something under here." That caught their attention. Ramirez stepped forward, eyeing the patch of disturbed soil. "What do you mean, something?" he asked. I crouched down and pointed to the metal edge peeking through the dirt. "I don't know what it is, but it's buried deep. It's old, though. Been here a long time." For the first time, they weren't just looking at me. They were looking at it. Officer Thompson knelt beside me, brushing away some of the loose dirt. When her fingers scraped against the metal, she frowned. "It's a box. A locked one." Ramirez let out a breath, glancing back toward the street. We're going to have to open that. Lisa was still watching. Only now, there was something different in her expression. Because this wasn't the outcome she had expected. Not at all. Officer Thompson tapped the top of the box, listening to the hollow sound beneath her fingers. It was old, rusted, and locked tight. The kind of thing that had been sitting underground for years, maybe even decades. Ramirez took a step back, sizing it up. This doesn't look like some random toolbox. This was put here on purpose. I swallowed, my mind running through every possible explanation. I had owned this house for 5 years. Before that, an older couple lived here. Quiet folks, kept to themselves. And before them, I had no idea. "We need to open it," Thompson said, her voice steady but firm. I glanced up at Lisa's house. She had moved away from the window now, but I could feel her presence, watching, listening. Ramirez pulled a pair of gloves from his belt and crouched down. "If it's locked, we have 2 options. We either take it downtown and process it, or—" Before he could finish, I grabbed the shovel and wedged the tip against the rusted latch. One firm push, and the metal gave way with a sharp crack. The lock snapped. The box groaned as I lifted the lid. The hinges resisted at first, stiff with age, but then it opened. The smell hit first. A deep, stale stench that had been trapped for who knows how long. The kind that made the back of your throat tighten, that told you whatever was inside wasn't meant to be found. Thompson took a step back, her nose wrinkling. "Oh, that's not good." I hesitated before looking inside. And when I did, my stomach twisted. There were bones. Small, fragile-looking bones. Bundled together, wrapped in what looked like the remains of an old, tattered cloth. And beside them, a stack of faded photographs, edges curled with age. A child. A little girl. Her face, frozen in time, stared back at us from the black and white images. She couldn't have been older than 6 or 7. Everything around me faded. The cops, the sirens, the cold air settling in. All I could see were those pictures, that cloth-wrapped bundle, that box sitting beneath my driveway this whole time. Ramirez muttered something under his breath before standing up straight. "We're gonna need forensics out here, now." Lisa wasn't watching anymore. She had disappeared from her window entirely. But for the first time tonight, I wasn't thinking about her at all, because whatever was going on here, it was way bigger than some nosy neighbor calling 911. The air had changed. It wasn't just the smell, it was the weight of what we had just uncovered. Officer Ramirez stepped away, his hand already on his radio. "Dispatch, we need forensic support at this location. Possible human remains discovered." His voice was steady, but I could hear the edge in it. Thompson knelt closer, pulling a flashlight from her belt. She shined it over the bones, careful not to touch them. The fabric they were wrapped in had nearly disintegrated, but you could still see traces of pink. It must have been a blanket once. I felt something press against my chest. A deep, unsettling realization that whatever I had just dug up had been here long before me. "How old do you think they are?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Thompson shook her head. "We won't know for sure until forensics gets here, but—" She exhaled sharply. "Judging by the state of decomposition, decades, maybe longer." Decades. Someone had buried a child under my driveway before I ever lived here, before the last owners, before I even knew this place existed. Ramirez crouched again, reaching for the stack of photographs beside the bones. He lifted the first one carefully, holding it up to the light. The girl stared back at us. Dark curls, a shy smile. She was standing in front of a white house, my house. My breath caught. Thompson flipped through the other photos, her expression hardening. They were all of the same child. Some with a man and woman, their faces slightly blurred from age. Others with a small dog beside her, playing in the front yard. I swallowed. Who is she? Ramirez didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned over one of the photos. There was something written on the back in faded ink. Margaret, 1967. Lisa's front door slammed shut. The three of us turned in unison, but she was already gone, retreated inside, her blinds drawn tight. And that's when it hit me. She had called the cops because she thought I was doing something wrong. But the moment she realized what was actually buried under my driveway, she disappeared. And that told me everything I needed to know. The night felt colder, the kind of cold that settled deep, past the skin, past the bones. Ramirez kept flipping through the photos, his face unreadable. Thompson stepped back, exhaling sharply. "This isn't just some missing person case. Somebody buried her here," she muttered. "Somebody put her under this driveway like she was never supposed to be found." I looked back at Lisa's house. Lights off, curtains shut, but my gut told me she was still there, listening. "Lisa knows something," I said. I didn't even have to think about it. Thompson glanced in her direction, then back at me. She wasn't disagreeing. Ramirez sighed, standing up straight. "We'll be looking into the records, seeing who lived here before you. But right now, we need statements. You and her." He nodded toward Lisa's house. I didn't say it, but I already knew how this was going to go. Lisa wasn't coming outside. Lisa wasn't going to answer questions. Lisa wasn't going to admit a damn thing. Because this wasn't about some random 911 call. She was scared of what we found. The forensic team arrived within the hour, their floodlights turning my front yard into an active crime scene. Officers marked the area, bagging the remains, taking the photographs. The once quiet street was now filled with police chatter and the occasional burst of static from their radios. I stood back, arms crossed, watching them work. The name on the back of that photograph wouldn't leave my head. Margaret, 1967. Who was she? What happened to her? And why was she buried here? Thompson walked up beside me, lowering her voice. "Records show the house was built in 1959. First owners were a couple named Richard and Eleanor Warren." The names meant nothing to me. I had never heard of them. "Had any kids?" I asked. Thompson's jaw tightened. She didn't answer right away. "One," she finally said. "A daughter, Margaret." The weight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. "You're telling me the people who lived here first, the very first owners, had a daughter named Margaret, and she, what, disappeared?" Thompson's expression darkened. "Not just disappeared. She was never reported missing. No records of a search. No police report. Nothing." I turned my head slowly toward Lisa's house. I thought back to her face when she saw what we found, that sharp retreat, the way she slammed her door shut. "How long has Lisa lived here?" I asked. Thompson didn't hesitate. "Since 1972. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to, because we both knew what that meant. Lisa wasn't just a neighbor. She was here after Margaret disappeared. She had lived across from this driveway for over 50 years, which meant one of two things. Either she knew exactly what happened, or she knew who did it. And that's when I realized this story was far from over. Lisa's house remained dark. No movement, no sound. Just the weight of a woman hiding behind thick curtains, pretending nothing had happened. But she knew. She had to know. The forensic team worked through the night, carefully removing the remains from the box, photographing every inch of the site. I watched from my porch, exhaustion creeping into my bones. At some point, Ramirez walked up, his hands on his belt, his face unreadable. "We'll be running DNA. If we get a match, we'll know for sure who she was." But we already knew. Margaret, 1967. The little girl with dark curls, standing in front of my house in those old photos. "And Lisa?" I asked. Ramirez glanced at her house, then back at me. "We'll question her, see if she remembers anything." But I could already hear it in his voice. She wouldn't talk. Not easily. Not after all these years. Thompson stepped up beside us, holding her phone. "I checked old property records. Lisa's parents lived in that house before her. Moved in 2 years after Margaret disappeared. They both passed away in the early 90s, left her the home." Ramirez scratched his chin. "If her parents moved in right after the first family left..." I finished the sentence for him. "Then maybe they knew something." Thompson nodded. We stood there in silence for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle. This wasn't just about a buried box. This was about a girl who was supposed to be forgotten. I turned back toward Lisa's house, my fists clenching. She had been so quick to pick up the phone when she thought I was doing something suspicious. But when the truth came out, she hid. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ramirez sighed. "We'll keep digging. But in the meantime, get some rest. We'll keep you updated." Rest. I wasn't sure how I was supposed to do that, because while the police packed up for the night, while the lights faded and the voices died down, I knew one thing for sure. Lisa wasn't scared of me that night. She was scared of what I found. Because sometimes the things buried under our feet aren't just old secrets. They're truths that were never supposed to see the light of day. And the people who buried them? They're still watching, still waiting, still hoping that no one ever digs deep enough to find out the truth. But the truth has a way of coming back. And for Lisa Montgomery, I had a feeling this was only the beginning. Sometimes the real crime isn't just what was done, but how many people chose to stay silent. How many times do we ignore the truth because it's easier to pretend we didn't see it? How often do we turn a blind eye to the things that don't affect us until they do? The past never stays buried, and sooner or later it comes back, whether we're ready or not. What do you think Lisa knows? Drop your theories in the comments. Let's talk.